welcome love. I welcome harmony. I welcome...
This is One More Breath, a struggle for self and soul, written by Lynette Chennell. I could not put this book down at all. I found it compelling. I found it in depth. I found that it was a really good account of a life. Lynette's book goes into great detail of her journey, of her traumas, of the abuses that she's suffered, the darkness that she's been through. And it's also when she stepped into the light and how she was able to heal herself. And now she's gone on to help others. So she is a treasure. Now, what I got from this book is it made me feel not so alone. I have experienced some similar things as she has, and I find that reading the words that she was able to really, I felt like she was describing my feelings sometimes, and even some perspectives that I've experienced in my own life and journey. And I felt that really, truly valuable, because stories are healing. I mean, that's why we, especially women, we get together, we share, we talk, and when we do that, we heal. She speaks about her parents, her siblings, her partners, and her children, all while sharing her own perspective of how she coped, how she survived, what she was searching for, and how she came through the challenges that were facing her. God connected me with this book to help heal a part of me that I can't even really put words to. So, without further ado, I'm going to do a reading. Acutely disconnected from the world around me, I sometimes sat alone in the lunch shed, blinded by a deluge of tears and drowning in emptiness. Once, a small group of girls found me and asked what was wrong, but I could not speak. There were no words, no sounds. How could I tell? What could I tell? What I held locked inside was unutterable. Because of the constant trauma and violence in my life, I failed dismally at school. In a continuous state of shock and traumatized disassociation, I was unable to learn. By the time I finished grade 4, I knew next to nothing and was held down to repeat the year again. When other kids in the class knew their times tables and how to tell the time on the clock, I wanted to disappear. I never caught up and spent one mortifying year after another struggling in the classroom. Not only was I bad and dirty, I was stupid too. I remember once being ill with tonsillitis and spending the day in the school sick room, floating in and out of a feverish delirium. I heard the school bell ring and children laughing, woven between long periods of frightening quiet. I kept watching the door, hoping my mother would appear. I wanted her to pick me up in her arms and take me home. I couldn't understand why she didn't come. I lived in a constant state of abandonment. When I think of my mother, I recall a solitary figure who had few friends. She was a loner and battler through her marriage, keeping our family problems concealed behind the walls of our home. I do not remember her in any meaningful way, not the sound of her voice or the warmth of her smile. The greater impression is of a distant woman with a biting anger that came out whenever she brushed my hair. She'd rip the comb through my tangles, yelling at me when I cried. I was told to put up with it. She had to when her mother had done it to her. As for my father, I don't remember him ever talking with me kindly or loving me throughout any part of my childhood. I don't remember being touched by him in a way that didn't hurt. There were times at night when I needed to go to the toilet after being put to bed. My father would angrily accuse me of lying and saying I was just trying to stay up longer. He'd follow behind wearing a threatening face, warning me if I didn't urinate, I'd get a hiding. I had no privacy sitting on the toilet and always froze with him standing in the doorway, watching over me with his hard, piercing eyes, almost disintegrating me with what felt like hatred. The light from the bulb burned bright, magnifying the size of his body as it filled in the doorframe, and intensifying my awareness of how small and exposed I was. My father must have had enough of the harsh fishing life. He had his share of sea boils that scarred his shins and the demanding work that strained his back. Using his experience in hotels, he took a job as a manager in a small pub in the hills, and we moved again. I felt incredible relief to be leaving the school I was in. It was the worst experience of lonely, vacant existence of anywhere I'd been, and I was desperate not to have to go through the embarrassment of yet another new school after we relocated. In the classroom, I endured enormous humiliation, each day spent wishing I could fade away. I had nightmares about it and dreams that seemed so real where at last I was old enough to not have to go to school anymore. Each time I woke to the brutal reality and cried into my pillow. Our new home was the pub itself. Each of us had a room originally intended for paying guests. It had been a hotel in its earlier years. We had a TV room of our own, and our kitchen was the hotel's main kitchen, where my mother cooked the counter meals. There was also a large dining room just off the kitchen, still partially set up but no longer in use. With my father back in our lives full time, it didn't take long for life to become overshadowed by our history. He was still a very heavy drinker. Fighting between my parents returned with the environment and free-flowing alcohol, and as time passed, my father became more and more volatile. I could feel him once again getting closer and closer to unleashing his violence on my mother. So could she. The hotel was a rough place. Sunday sessions saw our beer garden packed with young people as bands played rock and roll. Fistfights were common. My father was the bouncer as well as the barman, and was often embroiled in the fighting, banning people from coming onto the premises and receiving threats to his safety because of it. One night, a brick came crashing through one of the front bar windows. The noise of breaking glass, followed by scuffling in the hallway, drew me out of our private lounge to investigate. I found my father wrestling with a man half his age on the floor. The younger man had had a knife, and my father was trying to take it from him. My screaming mother, heavily pregnant with a surprise addition to our family, was reaching into the fray with her hands, trying to break it up. Moments later, she was shoved hard to the ground, knocking the wind right out of her. Thankfully, she was unhurt, but it was terrifying to witness. Now 14, my body was more fully developed, much to my parents' disapproval. My womanly curves and well-endowed breasts were gaining me attention from the young men who drank at the hotel. They were referred to as hoodlums, and I was warned to stay away from them. But one night after closing, my father, who was usually very drunk, cornered me in the corridor with warnings about my safety. He pointed out that my lack of strength to defend myself should someone have it in mind to rape me, and threatened to throw me on the ground there and then and rape me himself, just to prove it. Paralyzed with fear, I searched his eyes desperately, trying to gauge the situation. I waited, wondering if he was going to follow through with his threat. My father went on instead to lecture me, finally letting me go after his talk ended with him in tears, telling me how much he loved me and that he was only concerned for my well-being. My boyfriend and I became engaged, and we had our engagement party at the lodge. His family and mine attended, but both sets of parents only endured the celebration. Neither group felt comfortable with the other. My fiancé enjoyed drinking, but then so did everyone else. It was how people had fun. He also had a moody side. I unwittingly seemed to do things that somehow I was supposed to know not to do. Each upset was a shock, and they would come out of nowhere. I'd try to understand what it was I'd done, then apologize and plead for forgiveness so he'd smile at me again. Losing his approval brought on a terrible panic-filled pain. I couldn't get comfortable in our relationship. It was way too unpredictable. I became nervous and watchful, needing to hold myself taut and ready. Intrusive, scary thoughts, together with grotesque images of my own dead and bloodied body, started popping into my mind. The local shire decided to close the lodge, and I moved back home with my parents. I couldn't hide the difficulties in my relationship. I was told I could do better, which was puzzling to me. Everything they said about my fiancé and his family was in many ways true about my own. To my mind, the only difference was our troubles were hidden behind an acceptable front, while theirs were sprawled out in the open. It was impossible to believe I was worth anything more than the way my own parents treated me and each other. It seemed hypocritical to be told I was lowering myself and embarrassing them, when at the same time rumours were rife about my father and a well-known female member of the bowling club. His own alcoholism was in full swing, coupled with the same ugly behaviour he'd always bestowed on us behind closed doors. My father's double standards and my mother's frequent barbs about me becoming just like a black woman were hurtful and only served to make me more determined to stay in the relationship. My mother kicked me out of the home, and I moved in with my fiancé and his family, where I saw the same abuse of alcohol and family dysfunction I'd grown up with, just in another culture. I ended up out of my depth and mixed up with racial tension in the town, becoming identified as one of them by association. Within 6 months of meeting, my boyfriend and I had married, left the wheat belt, and moved into a unit in the city. I was 3 months pregnant on the day of our wedding and finally over trying to control my body. The challenges were inevitable. The day after our wedding, I relaxed my tummy for the first time, relieved to feel as though I didn't have to hold it in any longer. I was legitimate. I knew my marriage was a mistake, but it was a clouded knowing, obscured by all the fear I'd accumulated over the course of my life. I was oblivious to any real feelings or desires other than a concealed self-revulsion. I had no dreams or ambitions. I was a blob, moulded and shaped by the winds and storms of other people's lives, driven by an unconscious need to constantly keep moving. On the day of my wedding, I gained more than a husband. I gained an image of normalcy and respectability. I had everything I thought I was never going to have: a home, a family, and a future. From the time of my 21st birthday, I'd had many moments of dread where I'd tried to visualize myself in the future, only to be staring into an immeasurable black and barren void. I had thought it meant I was going to die young. Like a chameleon, I blended myself to fit acceptably with my changing circumstances. It was a honed survival skill, something I did without thinking. But when finally forced to stand still and live in one place, be the same person every day, I was no longer able to outrun the churning I'd kept at bay for so long. I slowly began to break through as I found myself in a role I did not know how to play. My husband and I didn't know each other. We had little in common other than we were both wounded, empty people. Our romance had begun as thoughtless escapism. It didn't take long before living with my parents, particularly my father, dredged up haunting feelings of being small and despised. He still zeroed in on me with hurtful comments laced with contemptuous spite. When he drank, his eyes held the same look that had terrified me so much as a child. If there was a conversation about anything, I gave my opinion or talked with seeming knowledge on any subject, he would laugh scathingly and tell me to keep my mouth shut unless I had something intelligent to say. Sometimes even at the dinner table in front of my husband and our 3-year-old daughter, nothing had changed. There were poorly veiled, snide remarks comparing me to my middle sister. In my father's eyes, she was, by virtue of her status as the attractive, good daughter, acceptable, while I was her opposite. He made me feel unacceptable and self-conscious, and even though I was not particularly overweight, I took up aerobics in the lounge room, hoping to improve my appearance and shake his self-confidence. But I was made fun of for supposedly making the walls of the shop shake. Sometimes in the middle of a workout, he'd come through the lounge to use the bathroom, slowing his stride long enough to look my way with a snigger that spoke volumes. For the most part, I liked being around my mother, even though as time went on, an underlying tension began to build between us. It came from all the unspoken things, the old hurts and stories that were buried and hidden. More than at any other time, I talked awkwardly to her about my unhappy marriage, my confusion over what love was, and the way my father treated me. I longed for her to be my safe and supportive refuge, a place where I could receive the kind of wisdom and strength only a loving mother could provide. I'd grown up believing I was bad, guilty, and sinful, with something inherently wrong with me. Through the program, I was given another perspective, one that told me I was none of these things, but that my parents and our family as a system had been sick. The revelation was like having a blindfold ripped from my eyes without having time to adjust to the explosion of light. On my first night, I ran in shocked disbelief from the building, choking on tears, desperately trying to cope with the unexpected welling up of raw emotion. It was more than I could bear. I spent my whole life seeing myself as being at fault. It hurt so much, and even more to realize I'd been allowed to think the worst of myself in order for my parents to feel comfortable with themselves. At Holyoke, I discovered the truth about my childhood and my family, the alcoholism, the violence, and the abuse in all its forms. I heard words, stories, phrases, and terms that described my life. I was vulnerable to concepts that, on the surface, seemed to offer me a haven. Some of the New Age beliefs, like abuse as karma for perpetrating the same kind of abuse on a child in a past life, or the belief that abuse happens as a planned spiritual lesson for the development of the human soul, gave what appeared to be a plausible explanation. Everything that happens to us is perfect in a perfect universe. All is as it should be in the divine order of things, all serving for our growth and greater good. If these concepts were true, it really was very simple. I was learning what it felt like to be on the receiving end of what I'd done to another while gaining experience to develop my soul. These explanations fitted in nicely with my low self-image and belief I deserved to be punished. After all, I was a sinful creature. They served to perpetuate entrenched feelings of being fundamentally polluted, but at the same time were enticing in their offer of redemption through the cycle of rebirth. No one knew what I lived with as a child or what I was dealing with in my adult life. I was going silently crazy on my own with a secret world inside my head. I learned well at an early age how to conceal things, so my outside was never a true reflection of what was going on inside me. I always felt alone, lost in a vast, dark, and barren land, unable to connect to anyone. Nothing existed within me, only a thick and heavy dullness, devoid of any joy. I lived with muted cries as the background to my thoughts, echoes from another time and place. Stuffing them down, I'd try harder to play my role as wife and mother, unaware that for much of the time I still lived in a semi-state of shock. I became progressively ungrounded, unable to find anything to hold on to. The gulf between my husband and I widened still further as I avoided being available for sex. He became angrier at my rejection and lack of interest, and more volatile and intolerant of our children, taking his frustrations out on them. I couldn't stand it and again wanted to leave. My husband must have sensed I was getting ready to run. In desperation, he came home one night with a cutting from a newspaper. It was a story about a woman by the name of Dr. Shirley Smith. She was the facilitator of a 3-day family of origin intensive dealing with healing relationships and was running a series of evening talks that led into the program. My husband suggested we attend one. The information night had an enormous impact on me, speaking to me in a language I easily understood. I was able to relate fully to what was being said, as though the steps I'd already taken to heal myself were the groundwork for just this very experience. Everything struck a deep chord. I knew the program was something I had to be involved in. My husband wanted to be part of it with me. But it was made clear from the outset by the people running the seminar he had to participate with his focus on himself and not me. He assigned 90% of the blame for the problems in our marriage to me and gave himself only 10%. So in his thinking, if I was fixed, all would be well. As much as I knew I was not coping with my life and that I had issues to deal with, I also knew my husband had his own problems he was not prepared to face. I was not going to allow my childhood to be used against me. Putting the majority of the fault of our troubles at my door was his way of not looking at himself, his own painful childhood, and how that impacted him and his ability to be in a relationship. It was made clear whatever I got out of the seminar had to be my own experience, free from any influence from my husband. If our marriage was to survive, we had to take responsibility for our own wounds, beliefs, and behaviours. We each had to examine how our respective childhoods had affected us as individuals and, in turn, how it played out in a relationship. It meant being open to honest self-examination. For me, I had nothing to lose. I had already left my marriage twice, returning the second time after 6 months under much the same circumstances as the first. I put off leaving my marriage for a third time, in the hope this program could heal the ache in my soul. I had a deep urgency to save myself. I wanted to have a life free of the death I carried inside, unseen by anyone and not understood by me. I knew conventional therapy couldn't help, only prop me up with medication and labels. I also knew the pain came from another place, but I didn't know where that place was or how to find it. As a seeker of freedom, I began a pilgrimage into my own interior. On arrival for our first day in the workshop, I felt afraid. I'd been through such a terrible time fighting the devil and evil imaginings that I'd overloaded on fear. I knew the program was to include subtle hypnosis through the power of suggestion, meditation, music, and visualization techniques, and that it was spiritually based in content. All the warnings and previous conversations I'd had with the Christian people still echoed in my head. Even meditation was taboo unless it was done with a Christian Bible in hand. Otherwise, the devil would have an open gateway. Yet something inside, I couldn't put my finger on, pushed me past my apprehension. The introduction evening had captured me with a beckoning ring of truth. The moment I set foot into the room, something began to release. I felt like a wounded, vulnerable child, eyes downcast in shame. I was no longer adult-sized but small, wanting only to hide, yet desperate to be seen at the same time. Everyone else seemed to be experiencing something similar. Tears flowed easily as the energy began to shape the process of the workshop. The atmosphere was alive and palpable. We were sheltered together in fellowship. Nothing existed outside of the room, and the space specifically created for the express purpose of what I can only describe as cleansing soul work. At the beginning of the intensive, we were instructed to set a clear intention for what we hoped to achieve. I set my intention at freedom. I had no clear idea what I meant by that, or what it would look like when I found it. It was such a desperate feeling. Soon enough, it became clear it was freedom from the past, freedom from the confines of my mind, and freedom from the black shadows that had been my constant companions for as long as I could remember. My husband and I remained on opposite sides of the room so we could be uninhibited by each other's presence. During the program, we only came together for specific processes requiring us being together as a couple. We talked little to each other as the 3.5 days progressed. I was coming face to face with myself at a level I never expected, connecting with subterranean parts. In a mirror exercise, I physically experienced how much I hated myself, discovering the meaning of toxic shame. My stomach muscles tightened and twisted in painful spasms as I tried to look at my own reflection. Waves of nausea rose and fell as I grappled to hold my own gaze. I saw cloudy grey smog surrounding my body. I understood it was my energy field, the filter through which I experienced the world, and through which people experienced me. It was oppressive and gloomy. During an exercise in grief work, I found myself in a cavernous depth of sorrow I could have drowned in, crying tears unlike any tears I'd ever cried before, the sound raw and ravaged to my ears. These were the wailings of my soul, the tears I never cried as a child, when all I could do was curl up, shut down, and disappear. For much of the time my body ached, my head hurt, and the vibration of the sound of my own voice caused unbearable throbbing. Determined, I pushed through, wanting to get everything out of it I could. I was captivated by the process of learning, welcoming of the tears and the pain. I desperately wanted to heal. As difficult as it was, my participation in the intensive became the anchor I'd been searching for. It acted as the catalyst for my spiritual awakening, building a fragile but tangible bridge between the world of light and my world of shadows. I received a miracle, a vision in answer to a heartfelt prayer. I'd asked for God's help many times over the years with what I thought was no response. He either did not hear me or just didn't care. But it was here at the Family of Origin workshop I finally found his presence. Abruptly, I let go of trying and released my will from force. My body went limp as I surrendered the struggle. I could not do anything on my own. Remembering the instruction of the workshop leader, I opened my heart and asked my higher power for help. Unexpectedly, and within an instant of the request being made, a breathtaking image replaced the familiar, desolate black. A young girl lay on green grass with her arms neatly by her sides. She looked like a sleeping princess from some long-forgotten fairy tale. There were no flowers or birds, no animals or butterflies, not even a whisper of a breeze, only tranquil stillness. Though there was no obvious movement, there was an aliveness flickering in the atmosphere, as though the particles of golden light from the sun were alive. The girl's body rested alongside the edge of a motionless, crystal-clear creek. I put her at age 6, an assumption made because of the age I'd been when my uncle came to my bed. Confusingly, it didn't quite fit. She looked older. Quickly, I put my confusion aside, preferring instead to just look at her. What I was seeing was incredible. I gave into an urge to write a foundations course for women with a holistic approach to personal and spiritual development. I called it Women's Spiritual Health, designed to run over an 8-week period. Giving myself permission to create it was a hesitant first step toward overriding my mental beliefs that I had nothing worthwhile to offer anyone. The good thing was nobody knew I was writing it. I was safe from criticism. What I found most surprising was how easy it was to write. I reconnected with a soulful, creative part of myself I'd left behind long ago. I wanted to ask someone if what I was writing was any good, but my father's voice of mocking contempt punctured my courage and labelled it as rubbish. For months, I kept the course in my desk drawer, grappling with what I thought was my audacity to write it. Dreams of my father began to plague my sleep. I found myself sitting in front of him, trying to speak words of long ago suffering. But when I opened my mouth, nothing would come out. Dropping my shoulders in grief and defeat, I'd give up trying. In each one of my dreams, my father simply got up and walked away, leaving me sitting in hopeless, wretched tears. I'd wake up choking on the words still stuck in my throat. Most disturbingly, I had no idea what the words were. So in closing, one more breath, a struggle for self and soul, has really impacted me so much, helped me dive deep into my own feelings of my past and things that I've experienced. And I think that this book is really healing. The most healing work that you can do is shadow work. So I want to leave you there. Thank you for staying tuned. Like, subscribe, share, comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And thank you very much for joining me. Lynette is a personal and spiritual development coach specializing in family of origin and child trauma. So if you find this video interesting, go and check out our website at www.lynettechennell.com. Thanks for watching.